Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, in for Jason Gale. And I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. Today we'll be talking about a moral issue that unfortunately has become a political dog whistle in recent decades, namely greed. Dr. Smith wrote on this topic recently in his Substack, the Logosletter, and his discussion there recalls the complexities surrounding the concept of private property, why we should have it, and the virtuous way to handle it. Now, before we get started, don't forget the basics. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, leave your comments down below, and don't forget to share this content with your friends. So, Dr. Smith, why don't you get us started? Walk us through this issue.
Sure, yeah. So, this is an issue I've been interested in for a good long time. You'll recall, Rich, that back when we taught together at a liberal arts college, Catholic liberal arts college, one of the courses that in philosophy we taught on a regular basis was an ethics course, right? So I think I probably taught that course, I don't know, 30 times. Because sometimes right. Because sometimes I'd teach two sections in the same semester, right? So, so it was a good number of times. And that was really great because it allowed me to spend some time sort of delving into issues and thinking things through, over and over again. And so one of the sections of that course that was quite popular was on the vices. I think often in moral theology, called the capital sins. Spend some time talking about things like greed and wrath and things of that nature, and that was always a part of the course that actually the students actually found quite engaging. I entitled the section that covered greed. I think I entitled it something along the line of sex, money, and murder. Just to try to get the attention of the students, but it worked, right? But one of the things I found, Rich, that was really interesting was that I would usually start by talking about lust first in the course. And of course, that would get people quite engaged, right? With a good bit of pushback, as you can imagine. But I would get almost the same amount of pushback when I talked about greed. Yeah. So it's kind of like initially a little surprising, I wasn't really prepared for that. I was like, well, that's interesting. Like, this really kind of ticked some people off. Yeah. There was just even a sort of a moderate sort of lesson that you shouldn't just try to accumulate as much money as possible, right, or something like that, right, was received with a lot of umbrage, right, and so that kind of clued me into, this is this is important. It also tied into some of the work I did in political philosophy as well. But so I got really interested in this, had some time and when I was teaching that course over and over again to explore it, and recently had the opportunity to present this information to a Catholic student group. And so it's just something I've been interested in for a long time. I think it's one of those areas that, especially for Americans, but not only, there's kind of just a blind spot, right? I think there's kind of a default position. You can correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but that as long as I earn my money or my property legally, right, I don't do anything immoral and that I can and almost maybe even should earn as much as possible and can do with it whatever I want, and there's no moral qualifications to either of those features.
I think that for people on the political right, that's probably mostly the way they think about it.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, I say, for the most part, right? Because obviously there are people on the political right who have a sensibility for a more traditional understanding of private property, like the one we're talking about today.
Sure.
And its limitations and proper use and so forth, right? There
Mm.
certainly are those people on the political right. But when you're talking about sort of that American kind of classical liberalism thing,
Sure.
right?
Right.
Then yeah, I mean, hey, it was it was fair. It was fair. I went out and I worked, I got it. It's
Sure.
mine.
Yeah.
Don't do
Yeah.
what you do.
Yeah. That's right. And I think interesting enough, there's a maybe even an attitude towards work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the view of the place of work in our culture, right? That's kind of tied to this as well, right? That is this sort of kind of almost that it's desirable to work endlessly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And tirelessly. And you know how we praise hard work, right? Uh Now, in some ways, you want to say, of course, yeah, sure. I mean, it's good to exert yourself and to earn your daily bread and those sorts of things,
Not be
but
lazy.
not be lazy, right? Those sorts of things. To be strong, to be active. At the same time, the ancient world didn't see in oil as something that's desirable in
Well, in
itself,
many ways, they
right?
saw it as a problem to be solved, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
That humanity has no leisure.
that's right.
Now,
Yeah,
in
that's right.
obviously, if you're in I think if you're in a more, and how can I put it, a more primitive
Sure.
socioeconomic condition, right?
Hmm.
Where whether or not you work determines whether or not you live, right,
Right.
on a daily basis.
Sure.
Um, then I think that problem of, slavery to work
Hmm. Hmm.
is probably more poignant to you, right? You're probably more aware of it, I would imagine.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
certainly that would have been the case in the Middle Ages. There
Hmm.
weren't a lot of
Hmm.
safety nets in the Middle Ages for
Hmm.
people, right?
Hmm.
In the contemporary society, I think oddly we can lose sight of this,
Hmm.
of the fact that there's a tendency of human beings to be enslaved to work,
Hmm.
because we don't really feel like that because there are safety nets.
Hmm. Hmm.
Does that make any
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It does. It's strange, right?
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we think that if we just work all the time, I mean, there's a real paradox there, right? I mean,
Uh-huh.
if I work all the time, I have no leisure in my life, then I must be the virtuous one. I'm free. I'm not slave. I'm not a slave.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas actually,
But
it's kind of the opposite. You're
it's
sort of
kind of the
like,
opposite, right?
you're like, I mean, there are people who, for some good reasons, work extraordinary amounts of time. At the same time, you want to make sure it's for a good reason, right?
Yeah.
And not simply like an irrational accumulation of wealth. But maybe we should just jump in here and think about, what would be like an irrational, sort of attitude towards wealth. Interestingly, Thomas, of course, considers the fact, so I'm taking my approach here from Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas considers the fact that, and he's not alone, that private property isn't the only option, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this goes in the philosophical tradition, of course, goes back to Plato and Aristotle. They both talk about various ways of distributing goods, right? External goods. And of course, Christian commentators, including, St. John Chrysostom and others, are aware of the New Testament example, right? Of the church, the early church, sharing all things in common, right? So, Thomas is aware of the possibility that we might not have private property, right? That we could arrange for property and money and so forth to be held jointly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Plato, as famously, we well know, hypothesizes about the possibility of communism, right? Where all the property is held in common. One thing people that often get wrong about Plato on that is that's really actually just for the guardians. It's not for everybody. But in any event,
Mm-hmm.
there is the idea that Thomas is aware of there's a possibility other than private property,
Yeah.
namely common property. What would look like? And I think you want to start with maybe a non repulsive, sort of example. But say, you're in a relatively, say, primitive situation, and you decide, there's only maybe two families together in an area, and you decide, our resources are limited, our ability, our labor is limited. It's just going to be better if we just throw all our stuff together, right? And we work together, and we all, have a common table, common food, common tools, because this is
so let's,
right. You can
to make the situation pretty simple, right? You say, well, there are tools. Okay. So let's say there are tools. We have some garden tools. We can cultivate some soil and grow some stuff and take care of our chickens. We got some chickens, right? A chicken coop. We have a well.
That's right.
A wheelbarrow. That kind of stuff. And together, they're two separate families here, and together we work on this stuff, and we share the produce.
That's right. Yeah. We share the tools, we share the produce, those sorts of things. We might even share security arrangements, that sort of thing, right? So you can imagine, right, a situation in which it might make some sense, right, to have everything in common, right? At least in terms of property, or
even say lots of things in common. If not everything, but at least lots of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and of course, interestingly enough, we kind of forget this a little bit, but Thomas, of course, Aquinas and other medieval thinkers would have been aware of this in terms of the religious orders, right?
Of which they were part, right?
That's right. Oddly enough, we kind of miss this sometimes, but they're kind of like nonprofit corporations in which everything is shared in common, right? And sometimes we're almost, very successful because they did, like the Cistercians, for example, especially in France, ended up being very fine farmers, right? And kind of worked the land together. And so again, another example, right, of having things in common. But Thomas rejects this ultimately, right, as the required view, right? And says that and argues that private property is actually a good thing, right? But of course, he begins with making a some clear definitions and distinctions, right, to kind of set this argument up. And of course, that's always helpful. But he talks about private property in terms of the Latin term proprium, right? He calls it quasi proprium, which is a nice term, right? Nice phrase altogether. Proprium in this context means something like one's own. Right. So it might express something we might say in English, like, my hand, right? It's mine, right? It's proper to me, right? Now, what he says about private property, interestingly, is that it's quasi proprium. It's as if it were one's own, right? Which is a very interesting sort of qualification. I think he's thinking analogously, right? Moving from the clearer instance of my hand, which is very clear. What do I mean by? I mean, it's literally part of me, right?
If I take that away from you, then I've done real violence.
That's right. It's an integral part of me, right? Such that I will not function as well. I might survive, of course, but I will not function as well, right? And it would be also would be severe wounds there, right? So you start with that sense, okay, but then I can also say, well, this is my sweater, right? Or my glasses. I could talk about my house, right? Now, those are not natural parts, right, of me. That is, this sweater will at some point wear out, and I'll probably wear it till it wears out. But once it's worn out, I will get rid of it, right?
You won't mourn too much. You'll be like, oh, I like that sweater, but
yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's not as if I've lost literally a part of myself, right? My body will continue to function as well as it did beforehand without that sweater, right? So it's not a natural part of me. But property, right? Private property, we treat as quasi proprium. as if it were a part of me, right?
Mhm.
And so just like you can't take my hand from me without it being assault, right? Similarly, you cannot take my sweater from me without it being either theft or robbery,
Oh,
right? Right. That's a violation, right? Because this is quasi-proprium. It's as if it were a part of me.
yeah.
And what it really violates, what that consists in then is, so you're taking this from me means I can't use it anymore. I've lost control of it. So for
Right.
Thomas, and he really gets this from Roman law, there's for something to be quasi-proprium means that you have dominum, right?
Mhm.
You have lordship over it, right? Mastery of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I really like that actually, because in one ways it makes it very clear, right? What we're talking about, right? Sometimes when people talk about property, it sounds a little weird. Like, what is ownership? What does it mean to own something?
Mhm.
Well, Thomas, I think, develops, from Roman, from his sources, a pretty clear notion. It means to have control of it, right?
Uh-huh.
You have permanent control of it, such that you don't have control of it. You might ask to borrow my sweater, right? And I could loan it to you, but you can't take it, right? Without my permission, because I have dominum over it. I have lordship over it. I
Yeah.
have control over it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And there are reasons for that, right? It's not just totally
Mhm.
arbitrary.
Right. Yeah. So you could ask, okay, maybe that's what private property is.
Uh,
Is that a good arrangement? Right.
yeah. Why do we have it? How do we come
Why
about?
should we have it? Yeah. So Thomas's answer, and this is, kind of fits with his general sort of teleological approach to things, is he thinks that our right,
Yeah.
to private property is tied to the fact that we need to be able to control the means of human flourishing.
Right. Right.
So, human flourishing is our natural end, right? Human happiness. We don't have to argue for that. It's our end, right? And we pursue all the things that we pursue in virtue of that end or for the sake of that end. Well, as it turns out, unlike the other animals, we need many artifacts, right? We need land, which is an artifact, but we need land. We need houses. We need tools, like we were talking about before, in order to flourish as human beings, right?
Right. Clothing appropriate to our environment.
Absolutely, yeah. And then even you think about, books, right, to help us learn. I mean, there's all sorts of things.
Because the acquisition of knowledge is part of our natural function, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So people, why do you have so many books? Because I want to be happy. Right. It's true. Right. I want to be happy. But so that he ties in, right, this idea that of private property, dominum, right, mastery, control of material things, to the idea of human flourishing. So in order to flourish well, I need to eat. I need to provide food for myself and for my children, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in order to do that in a rational, efficient, and secure way, I need to be able to control, right, a certain amount of food, right?
Yeah.
And control space in which that food is stored, right? And control the means by which I acquire those two things, right?
Right.
You follow all that, right? How all that sort of together. So I need a house. I need a place to store the food. I need the means to get the house and the place to store the food, and I need the means to get the food.
Storing the food.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You start to, well, actually, there's a lot there, right?
Yeah.
And so, if I'm going to flourish, I'm going to feed myself and my children, then I need to have control over those things, right? I just think about trying to do this on a regular basis, but people could come and take food out of your refrigerator whenever they want it.
Yeah, right. And suddenly you've lost control of that thing that's necessary for your flourishing.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. You can think about it maybe in terms of like a car or something, I have been interested in these in Nashville. They have these public scooters, right?
Yeah.
That people can use, right? Which is interesting, right? In a way, it's an interesting social experiment, I think, sort of. But because they're free to use, a lot of them, right? Or very low cost, and you don't have to ask anybody's permission, right? Of course, they end up piled up in all these odd places.
Yeah, we haven't perfected the system yet, but
right. But
But
here's
the
the
idea, right? The idea that, well, it's a good, useful to human flourishing.
Mhm.
Um, but maybe it's the sort of thing that no one person needs to
Control.
control.
Yeah. Now, I notice we're not really doing that with cars, right?
Yeah, yet
Because there's a lot of investment. Yeah. There's a lot of
there
investment in a car, right?
there are
Uh,
places where you can
do a little bit of
um,
that, right?
just you sort of rent a car for like with a like one of the, like one of the scooters. But
Mhm.
but the thing is, you we're not going to see probably a lot of that in our society, at
Sure.
least not widespread, except maybe in cities.
Right.
Because I mean, if you live in a city, then your need
With
for a
transportation.
car,
Yeah. Mhm.
I don't know what people are going to say. It's not just about need. But good, let's have that discussion later. Right now, I'm saying objectively, right? You can
Right.
get by day to day without a car. You can
Mhm.
walk most of the places if you live in a densely populated area where
Mhm.
you go down the stairs out of your apartment and there are restaurants and
Sure.
shops.
Right.
You don't need a vehicle most of the time. And I remember when I was younger and I thought if I lived in New York, in Manhattan or something, I wouldn't own a car. I would
Mhm.
not,
Sure.
I would want to not own one, right?
Right.
Um, but but there might still be a purpose for such forms of transportation
Mhm.
occasionally, right?
Sure.
And then, but you don't need to own it.
You don't need to own it. Yeah. Whereas, for a lot of us who live in the suburbs, right,
You
we
do
do
need to
need
own
to,
the
you
car.
do need to own it, right? If you're going to get around anywhere at all, right? Even just to get groceries and much less commute
Right,
to work, right?
right,
So, the you need to have control over those things, right? And if
right,
you object to the way American infrastructure is laid out, well, we could come up with other examples, right?
right.
The point being that we need to be able to have control over the necessities of our life, right?
Right, right.
And that's what justifies most foundationally, right, the right to private property. Now, Thomas adds to that a couple of other things. One is it does allow us and to cultivate the virtue of prudence, as well as the virtues of stewardship, right, or liberality, if you like,
Hmm.
right. So you have care over these things that you have to start becoming responsible. We call it responsibility. You have to start planning, right? About these things, about acquiring money, investing money rightly, using money to get what you need and not blow it on frivolous things, that sort of thing. So it does allow you to, or at least encourages you, right, to practice prudence, frugality, stewardship. Another important one is that it does make you more zealous in the maintenance of these things. Which
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking about the scooters here, and one of my worries about the cars would be like, well, who's going to really maintain it, right? Because
Yeah.
like I only have an interest in keeping it so good enough during my trip, right? I can
Uh-huh.
imagine being in it and like maybe the last guy was a jerk and just trashed it or something,
But you
and
see how
then
the scooters are
yeah,
treated,
right,
right?
yeah,
They're
the
just
scooters,
abandoned, they lying
yes,
on the side of the
right,
sidewalk.
right. And we find this, that famously homeowners tend to be more diligent than
Then
renters,
mhm.
in terms of not trying to put down renters. We've all been there, but just saying, and it makes a sense. There's a like how much as a renter should I invest in the landscaping of the place I'm renting? Very little,
Yeah,
right?
because you're not going to benefit
Long
when you move
term.
out, like you're not going to get any of that equity.
That's right. That's right. It's just gone, right? So in the event, he does think that if it's your own, you'll be more zealous in its upkeep. And then third, and I think this is actually really helpful, that it avoids conflict, right? Because just think about sharing something, like just say even in your own family, right? A lot of conflict arising, like sharing the restroom, right?
Hmm.
Like sharing a car, sharing, if you shared all things, then Thomas thinks that you would be in a situation where there'd be more conflict. So, anyways, all of those arguments taken together, he thinks that it's rational to have private property. And it's so rational that it's part of jus gentium. That
Hmm.
is, it is a conclusion of natural law that is so universal then it doesn't need to be legislated into reality.
Yeah.
It's already there. You
Yeah, it's
already
pre-political,
have.
right? In
That's
fact,
right. Right.
the political community arises out of this concern to a large extent.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be laws introduced to help us, sort of organize it well, but it's already there, right? It's
Yeah.
already presupposed. So, anyways, I think that's an interesting point there. What do you think about that case for private property?
I think it's a strong case for private property. I think, it's interesting from a political point of view, the concept of common law,
Sure.
right, which doesn't really involve legislation as such, right, but recognition of custom.
Mhm.
The it's an interesting category, maybe a discussion for another time, but like I think this is one of those places where you could really see where the concept of
Sure.
common law comes from and why it's an important political idea.
Mhm.
One which in our society we've kind of forgotten about to a great extent.
Right. Yeah.
Law is
That's
all
true.
positivistic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But there's an aspect of the concept of private property that I think is important to look at here that I'm not directly hearing in your articulation of it. And that is the exertion of work upon the material world. That in other words, I establish a relationship with the product of my labor. What do you think about that idea? How does that affect this concept?
I think it's interesting. I mean, that's kind of a Lockean idea. I think Leo the 13th takes it up some at the in what's the name of it? Rerum Novarum, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what to think of that. I think it's a very unusual, well, the way Locke sets it up anyways, it's very unusual situation, right? Because the way he's describing it is you show up, right? And nobody's there, right?
Yeah.
And you acquire a right to it because you mix your labor with it. I think the best I could say about it is this, that you have in some sense added value or brought value out of what was there that wasn't present, right?
Yeah, and it came out of you, right? You exerted your own energy.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And so there's some sense in which you've put something of yourself into the land and brought something out of the land that wasn't there before.
Right.
So I think that's true. I don't think that's the only way to articulate it. I mean, I think, let's say you could also articulate that same situation from an Aristotelian perspective, right? That is, you show up, nobody's there. Well, you acquire a right to work this part of the land, right? Because you need it, One interesting thing, both Locke and Aristotle would have this in common, that both would object to you placing claim over more than you could work.
Right.
Which is a part of Locke sometimes people leave out, right?
So it goes to this thing you were talking about earlier, right? With this idea that we could just accumulate indefinitely as much as we wanted, right? And people own vast amounts of real estate that they don't really do anything with it, right?
Sure.
But okay, so here's where I think Leo this is where I think this idea is important. Okay. I agree that the Aristotelian thing, nobody else is doing it. I need it. I need the opportunity, right? So I'm going to do it, and then I require a right to the produce. That's an important idea because it comes to the Catholic Church has this idea of a universal destination of material goods, right? That basically God makes the universe, the material universe, for the benefit of human beings. That he makes it so that we can live off what the world is.
Right. Sure.
right? And so there's that old medieval idea that what belongs to no one belongs to anyone, right?
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, so I show up, I need it, I need it. No one
Right.
else is here doing it. I'm not taking it
Mhm.
from anyone. It doesn't belong
Mhm.
to anyone, right? So
Right.
it belongs to anyone. It belongs to me
Mhm.
now because I'm going to work it and I'm going to
Mhm.
derive my livelihood off of it. Now, for you to show up and to take the produce of my labor
Mhm.
um, is basically to treat me like an animal,
Mhm.
the way you
Mhm.
would treat an ox who's
Sure.
you
Sure.
use him
Yeah.
to plow your field, right?
Right. Mhm.
You don't feel like you owe him anything,
Sure. He's an instrument. Yeah.
right? He's an instrument,
Mhm.
and we can't treat other human beings like that, right? So the whole idea of stealing
Mhm.
has you can articulate it that way, right?
Mhm.
Now,
Sure. You're taking something. Yeah. Go ahead. Good. Sorry.
okay, so remember what Leo was doing, and this takes us back to kind of the beginning of our discussion today, is that he was trying to thread the needle between communism on the one hand
Mhm.
and and like this laissez-faire capitalism that was, remember when he wrote this, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Sure. Late 19th century, right?
yeah, I mean, it was ruthless.
Yeah. Sure.
So people were being alienated from the produce of their labor,
Sure.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
they were being treated as mere instruments by some
Right.
employers. I don't want to,
Right.
yeah, people come up with exceptions,
Sure.
but by some employers at least,
Right. Yeah. Pretty widespread.
yeah,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So in this sense, right, this is a way of talking about, I guess, tying the worker, right, to the product,
hmm.
saying, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I think um the
So the employer doesn't have like it's not the case in Catholic thinking that the employer has absolute rights to set wages at any rate he can get away
right.
with.
That's right. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important, even though it might be all voluntary, right? And even if the employer owns all the property that's involved in the production,
Yeah,
right? Which in many cases he may, right? He might own all the tools, all the machinery, the land, and the facilities, right?
and even like
Um,
patents on the ideas, right? He might.
right, sure, yeah. Um, yeah, can certainly he's entitled uh, to use that property to support himself and support others, right? But not just for anything, right? For sure. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think
Okay,
it's all
so let's ask some obvious questions, all right?
okay.
How much is too much?
Is there too much? I think at all, right? And I think Thomas would say, yeah. And one of the things that's really great about Thomas on political matters, economic matters, is that because of the kind of teleological framework he uses, the same thing that justifies the existence of something also acts as a limit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when we say, for example, when we talk about political authority, Thomas is not an anarchist. No big shock there, right? He thinks there needs to. He believes in the authorities. Thinks there needs to be authority. Political authority is one of the highest authorities in his view, but it's justified by, and its existence is justified by its necessity for advancing the common good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Its existence is justified by that and limited, right? That is, when it acts contrary to the common good, it ceases to be an authority and falls into tyranny, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you get from the idea of the common good, both the reason for the existence of the political authority and its limitation, right? And then I think same thing here, or similar thing here with private property.
Yeah.
Private property is justified in the sense that you have a right to acquire what you need for human flourishing. It's also limited by that same ratio, right? That
Yeah.
same end, right? once you've gone beyond what you need for human flourishing, right, your right to it, at least morally, begins to diminish, right? To some degree, right? Again, even Locke recognizes, if you gather so many apples that you can't even eat them, right? That Locke even says this, right? If you gather so many apples that you have apples rotting, like your right to those apples ceases at the apple that you can't eat.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, like in Locke's view, right? I'm not exactly advocating that, but it's kind of along a similar way of thinking,
well,
right?
I mean, it does to me make a lot of sense, particularly if you're within reach of someone who doesn't have apples.
Right. Right.
I mean, now,
can you imagine somebody hoarding the apples? Now, there's a way around this. We talk about trade and all that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But can you imagine a terrible person, right, hoarding rotting apples?
Yeah.
As somebody else is starving.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's not a hard thing to imagine.
That's terrible.
People would. I mean, today, I don't want to, get into a debate about advocating for or against, limitations in law, right? Right now, but because I know the arguments people are going to make about how the free market tends to work these things out and all that. And, to some extent that's true. And I think there maybe sometimes it's not sometimes it doesn't work.
Sure.
But regardless, right? In principle is what I'm talking about. In principle, if I had an apple tree that produced more apples than I could consume, and my neighbor was in a situation where he didn't have food,
right? Yeah.
It does seem to me it'd be morally reprehensible for me to not allow him to take apples from my tree.
That's right. Yeah. Especially when you have enough and more than enough, right?
Yeah.
More than you can eat.
Right.
So that would be a stark example right there where we can say, again, you might have a legal framework that gives you a legal title to things beyond.
Yeah, but that's not where.
But yeah, just about morally, right?
Yeah.
That your right to private property is limited, and maybe there's some gradation here, but it's limited by what you need for human flourishing.
Right.
Right. Now, the next logical question is, what do you need for you? What is that? Right.
What do you need for human flourishing? But I think there's another. This is what people tend to get hung up on, is even if we could grant the principle that there is such a limit, and we could identify what we need for human flourishing, it's going to be, I think we can anticipate that there's going to be a wide sort of range here of like it's not going to be a stark line.
No, I don't think it
where
is,
it's the same for everyone, right?
Yeah, it's not a stark line, and unfortunately, sometimes people say, "Well, see, there's no standard; it's all subjective, so the hell with it," right?
Right, and that's what
I've gotten that response, right? Yeah, and I think that's just an inadequate engagement with the topic.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that have to be thought about here. One is your state of life, right? Like this is a work of practical reason to some degree, right? You have to think about, okay, we're talking about need for human flourishing. Well, to some degree, there's going to be a core basket of goods I think we can all recognize, right? Shelter, food, clothing, right? At least adequate, right? But more than I think you would say adequate, because we're talking about flourishing, not just survival.
Right.
So we're not saying, well, you just have a right to like a burlap sack you can put over you. Right? So this is not like some sort of austerity program.
If your house is a cardboard box, we have a problem.
That's right. Exactly. It's right. So it needs to be enough to flourish, right? So I think that means more than just the minimum, right? Or what's barely adequate. I think it means more than that, right? So I do think it's fine to even speak maybe here of a certain level of prosperity, right? I would be okay with that, but moderated, right? Moderated by various considerations, right? So let's take a single man who has no family, right? A single man who has no family, and say he has no prospects for whatever reason, okay? He's He's not going to get married, whatever, right? He needs less than the married man and the father, right? Now he still needs things, right? He still needs shelter, right? That sort of thing. And again, needs it not just to get enough to get by, right? But to flourish, right? So does need a home, a comfortable home. He needs one that gives him security, needs clothing that's adequate, again, to his station in life. That's going to be different if you're an attorney, right?
Yeah.
Than say if you're a welder, right? Both are fine professions. Both are wonderful and they're contribute.
But one guy needs to go to work in a suit.
That's right. Yeah, right. And the other person probably has a uniform, right? Or often does. So that's going to look different, right? The single man doesn't need to spend a lot of time worrying about life insurance, right? He might have a little bit just to make sure he gets buried and he doesn't, impose on his, on others, but he doesn't need a lot of life insurance. He doesn't need as much money or space, right, as the married man, right? Very simply because in order to flourish, he just doesn't need it, right? It's unnecessary to him, right? I would say that those would be the kinds of things you'd think about in terms of limits, right? Thomas, using the language of his own time, a very common language to talk about according to your state in life, both today and tomorrow, right?
So now tomorrow doesn't mean like just today's Saturday, so Sunday,
right? Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It means basically your foreseeable future.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So investing for the future, trying to put some money away for retirement, all that sort of thing, Thomas would be perfectly fine with. And I think is perfectly within what is acceptable, right? In terms of our attitude towards money, right?
How about like leaving an inheritance behind?
I think within measure, that seems to me fine. I mean, you're helping your that's another way of supporting, right? Your progeny, right? I think there's a difference, though. This is an important distinction here between desire and outcome, or intention and outcome. Thomas seems to be of the view that desiring much more than what I've described is actually greed, right? He doesn't draw the conclusion that everyone who's wealthy is therefore bad, right? It might just turn out became wealthy because of good luck, or because you worked really hard, but you weren't trying to become wealthy, but you worked hard and had a very profitable business or a product that the market had a highly desired, or something of that nature, right? But he does seem to have the view, right, that desiring, intending to accumulate more than what is required for flourishing, that's disordered.
Yeah. How about this? So let's say that without explicitly desiring to become immensely wealthy, I have become immensely wealthy, which, by the way, for the record, is false.
In case anybody's wondering.
In case anybody's wondering. So let's just say that I have become immensely wealthy without necessarily desire. Like, I didn't set out to become immensely wealthy, but now I am.
It's a common outcome for theologians.
Yeah, it happens all the time. So is this bad for me? Right. First question. And second question, whether it is or it isn't, right? Are there pitfalls? Okay, so go on.
It doesn't make you a bad man necessarily. Okay. Let's say this. Let's say that whatever is, but I would say it is potentially bad for you, right? And maybe even likely to be bad for you. I should probably say. It might be a bad idea for a large number of people to have a fully stocked bar in their home.
Mhm.
You know, maybe not for some, but for probably a lot of people, that's just not a good idea. You
Yeah.
know,
Uh-huh.
um, is it intrinsically evil? No, it's not. But may not be a good idea for some people, right?
Yeah.
Um, Similarly, with food, things of that nature, right? It does really seem that the tradition, and I think this is Christian tradition for sure, and really a New Testament perspective on these things, but also in the Aristotelian view to some degree, the great wealth is a danger, right?
Uh-huh.
In a lot of ways, that it's very easy, right, with great wealth, right, to put yourself in a bad position,
Yeah.
to reject God, to overindulge, all those sorts of things. Aristotle thinks it is, very consistent on this point that the middle is the best, is the most, a middle class position is the
Mhm.
one most likely to foster virtue,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
He says that too little, in his view, right? This is Aristotle, but too little in his view is going to be hard to foster virtue, right? You're not going to have the instruments for flourishing.
Right.
For one thing, right? It's likely to develop envy, those sorts of things.
Mhm.
But at the same time, that having too much, right, he thinks has
Yeah.
a tendency towards pride and luxury, right?
Right.
And so it's really in the middle who's in the best situation for the development of virtue, uh, financially and economically.
Yeah. So, and it's important to understand from Aristotelian virtue ethic, which we find also in St. Thomas, right? That virtues are tendencies toward action,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
They're
mm-hmm.
dispositions to act in certain ways toward the good.
Right.
And a disposition to act in a certain way can only really reach its fullness if, in fact, I can perform such an action.
Mm-hmm,
Right.
mm-hmm.
So the problem here, there is a real problem in from this
Sure.
perspective with poverty, because
Mm-hmm.
there are certain forms of action that are beyond my capabilities. I simply can't do
Yeah,
certain things.
that's right.
And
That's right.
therefore,
Yeah.
even if I have a disposition, say, to be magnanimous,
Mm-hmm.
right, or to be sort of liberal with my property, if I am so disposed, nonetheless, I have no surplus from which to do it.
Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't celebrate great
Sure.
events greatly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Magnificence, the virtue of magnificence, right? I can't
Mm-hmm.
throw a huge party at a wedding to celebrate a great
Sure.
event because I don't have the money.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I can't
Mm-hmm.
share my stuff because I don't have enough,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's a
Mm-hmm.
real problem with poverty. The problem with surplus, right, is it's it's that suddenly, because I never have to think about it, I'm presented with this delusion that I really am
Mm.
completely self-sufficient. And
Right.
now all
Yeah.
of a
Yeah.
sudden,
Yeah.
my
Mm-hmm.
dependency, the reality of my dependency upon the people around me, my society, God,
Right. Mm-hmm.
um, is obscured from my view because
Right.
I'm enabled to think I have I'm strong enough by myself.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. And this is why, like, the virtuous man who does become wealthy, right,
Uh,
um, should possess the virtue of liberality or stewardship, right, and should then be very apt and zealous to giving away the surplus, right?
yeah,
So, to some degree, this, that doesn't mean just like throwing money away in the streets, right, or something, but using it wisely. That wouldn't be being a good steward. Using it wisely to help uh, to increase human flourishing. Really important point there is that's the whole point of possession in the first place,
yeah,
right?
right,
Is
right,
human flourishing.
right.
So
So
it
this is the
once
part.
you've, yeah,
Yeah,
go
this is
ahead.
the part that, see, I want to bring us back to this because this is part of what you were saying earlier, and
Mhm.
it's really important. The idea that there's a common good interest in private property. Private property is
Sure,
defended by the political community,
sure,
and it's defended by the political
yeah,
community because there is a common good to it,
that's right, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. That
So,
contributes to it.
yeah, the society as a whole needs for there to be such a thing, or at least it's a proven way of accomplishing goods
That's right. Yeah. Mhm.
that are common to everyone.
That's right.
Now,
Yeah.
so the rich man is in a position he has surplus, and
Mhm.
therefore he's actually in a position to perform a function for the common good that
Mhm.
otherwise might not be performed. And that is
Sure.
that he can supply for the needs of the destitute. Now, you might say, well, there wouldn't be any
Mhm.
destitute if there was just a more even distribution of goods. Not so, because
That's
there
yeah. Mhm.
are, um, well, first of all, it's demonstrably, from an economic point of view, it's obviously false, right? Because we've
Right.
attempted
Right.
that. It doesn't seem to work out that way.
Right.
But let me give you an example of logistically why.
Mhm.
Say you have a hurricane and you lose everything.
Mhm.
Your house gets demolished. You've lost everything. You
Right.
had enough,
Right.
and
Right.
everyone around you has enough. No
Right.
one has surplus. How are we going to get you out of that situation?
Sure. Right. Right. Yeah. 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 That is. Yeah. It's going to be most helpful if there's somebody with a surplus, right? Especially, yeah, who can sort of donate to, and this is what we do, right? I mean, lots of times there's the kind of charitable movements, right, to get people to contribute, right, and
Uh-huh.
then to the people who go through that disaster, if they had no surplus, right,
They would
as you're
not be
saying,
able
then
to do that.
they wouldn't be able to help. Yeah. So yeah, the and this is not, but very importantly, this is not unjust to the wealthy person, right? Because the whole point of private property is the support of human flourishing. So
Right.
once you've achieved your own human flourishing, then it's right and virtuous that surplus be committed to the flourishing of others.
Right.
I do think there's a large variety of ways in which that can be done, and I think in creative way,
Yeah.
right? For that to be done, very interesting.
It does
Thomas
not necessarily
along.
mean
Mhm.
taxing the wealthy to the
That's what
point
I
where
think.
they only have as much in the bank as the next guy.
You cut it
Right. It
off at
doesn't really mean that. In
seven,
fact,
cut it off at like 89,000, right? Just 100%
yeah.
taxation for
Right. So
that.
it doesn't really mean that, right? So I think one thing it's important to think about is that um, the may a wealthy person may in order to distribute from his wealth in a becoming manner and in a prudent manner, right? That he has to live in a certain kind of way, right? In order to be able to do that. And
Mhm.
that state in life may require actually more stuff than I require.
Mhm. Sure.
Does that make
Yeah, I
sense?
think that's correct. Yeah, 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 absolutely. And here's the thing: is if the government takes all of it, right, then he can't practice the liberality, right?
Right. He can't practice that virtue, right?
So
So
what Thomas says about this.
you're actually doing harm.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. To what Thomas says about this, and other medieval theologians, right, is that we leave the surplus in the hands of the wealthy so that they may be lived, right,
Right.
and it would be inappropriate, right, for it to all be appropriated by the political community. At the same time, it would be inappropriate, for the wealthy man. So that's on that side, right? But it would be inappropriate for the wealthy man to simply use his wealth for endless indulgence, endless luxury, that sort of thing,
Yeah,
right?
that
Like
sort of
that.
opulence.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And in fact, I would go a little bit strong on this. That the Romans had this tradition, and I think this is I kind of like this, that if you ever built a home larger than the public temples, that was considered vicious and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
blameworthy,
Uh-huh.
right? That the temples need to be the largest, most magnificent thing, and that you are exercising hubris, right, and pride of
Yeah.
life to be. I like that. I think that's a kind of neat
Yeah. It's
cultural,
interesting to have some kind of standard, to have
that's
a
right.
culturally
Yeah.
accepted standard.
That's right. Yeah. I
Um,
do think that we've lost this entirely. But
yeah.
even in the 1940s and 50s, this had diminished some, but it was still there. And you can find it earlier on that the ostentatious display of wealth was considered vicious
Yeah.
and blameworthy. Um, in many cultures and for a long time in the West. In
Mhm.
fact, royalty and nobility had to make the excuse, and I think sometimes it was an excuse, sometimes it was probably honest, but in their display of wealth, that this was for the state and for the people. That is, it had a kind of a public good kind of function, right? If this is the king shouldn't be kind of dressed in rag, he's representing the commonwealth, right? But at the same time, that the need to even make that kind of justification, right, showed that there was a kind of, not that you need to go around looking terrible or something like that, but that the display of opulence and luxury was like I say, considered blameworthy.
Yeah,
Which I think is
yeah, it's
interesting.
base, it's vulgar.
Right. Yeah, it's vulgar.
Um,
Yeah, right. You shouldn't, a human being shouldn't need to do that, right? Even if that human being is wealthy. And I think that's the way to think
yeah.
of it. You're above that. Like, you
How
don't
about the
need
idea
to.
of considering the conditions of the less fortunate?
Sure,
Um,
that's another side of it. Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
So I dress myself in all kinds of bling. While
Right.
I mean, maybe I'm not directly in touch, right, with people
Sure,
who are destitute, but I know that they're out there.
sure. Yeah.
Where's that line? I think the big problem here, right, is where's the line?
Mhm.
Because the poor you will always have with you, right? We know
Sure,
there are always going to be
sure,
poor people,
sure.
and they may not be my immediate neighbors, but I know I don't have to
Mhm.
drive too far to find really poor people.
Sure, sure.
So
Yeah, I mean,
where's the point at
I
which?
think custom is helpful here,
Uh-huh.
and lots of times we don't look at. We can look at what is customarily accepted in our society in terms of what do we customarily associate with well-being or flourishing, right?
Mm,
And then going way beyond that, right? Would be, I think, the line, um, so you know I'm living in a home that's comfortable. I have two children that live with me, um and I have a very standard 3 bedroom. I mean, it's kind of like the 3 bedroom,
yeah.
small bedrooms though,
Ranch
like they're
house or
little.
something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. They're little tiny bedrooms, right? And there's a larger living room and a larger kitchen, and that's kind of it. I mean, it's a functional house, right? It's
Uh-huh.
comfortable, it's secure, it's functional. That sort of thing. I got a
Okay, so
small
let's say
garage,
now
whatever. But for me, by myself, with just two kids living in I don't know, 4,000 square
it
foot
gets the
mansion,
job done.
that would be a little, I would start to feel kind of weird about that. Like, what am I doing? Like, why do I have all this space? Like, no, again, maybe if I'm the king, I can come up with some reasons for it. I have to entertain and reasons of state. But at the end of the day, when we do see kind of this kind of opulence, there is always kind of the question of like, well, what is it for? It does seem to be unnecessary to human flourishing, right?
Uh-huh.
It'd be better committed to other purposes.
Yeah.
And I think one of the I know we've gone kind of long here, but one of the things that great wealth and the greed, right? Great wealth in itself is a danger in the tradition, right? But it's not necessarily evil. Greed is always evil.
Yeah,
That
the disordered
desire,
desire for it, right?
that's right. Yeah. The disordered desire for wealth, right, comes with all of these other things, right? This is again traditional, in the literature called the daughters of the vice, right?
Yeah.
And so in the case of greed, right, there's these daughters are I'll just read them here. This is not original to Thomas. He's just kind of quoting the tradition.
Yeah.
Treachery, fraud, falsehood, perjury, restlessness. I like that one. I think that's correct. Violence, and then this insensibility to mercy. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right. The person is kind of merciless, right? Like they don't. I think kind of for the reasons you're talking about, they don't perceive themselves to need any mercy,
Uh-huh.
right? And so towards others, they're like, well, just too bad for you,
Yeah, let them eat cake.
Yeah, there's just a pity, without pity, right?
Yeah. Also,
Towards
I think there's a
others.
psychological, so it's, deep down, right? They
Mhm.
recognize the disparity and
Sure.
they need to feel good about it. So don't ask me
Yeah.
to care about your poverty.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And then the restlessness, right? You think of the wealthy people seem to never be content, right? Maybe,
Because the
or at
material
least the greedy person.
goods, because the material goods that they've made the center of their lives are not sufficient.
They're not sufficient.
It's not,
Yeah.
they may
Yeah.
be net to some degree, material wealth is necessary for our
Correct.
flourishing, but it's not the
Mhm.
only thing necessary for our flourishing. So when we make it our
That's right.
primary focus,
Right.
then we take our focus off of those other goods that are also necessary for our flourishing.
Yeah. And necessary, and even much more important,
Important,
right?
right?
Because even Aristotle, you're right, he recognizes that you need a certain amount of material goods to be virtuous, but he also says it's not a lot, and he says that the virtuous man will deal with, right, lack better
Mhm.
than the vicious person. But yeah, these other goods are more constitutive, right? The material goods are merely mutilate, right?
Mhm.
For flourishing. They don't instantiate it, right? The things that instantiates actual flourishing or beatitude, at least even in a philosophical sense, are friendships,
Yeah,
learning, wisdom, those sorts of things, right?
yeah,
The experience of beauty, contemplation. Those are the things that actually instantiate
right,
happiness, right?
right. So the distinction again is the distinction between bonum utile, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that's good because it's useful for other
Mm-hmm.
things,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and bonum honestum, right? A thing
That's
that's
right.
the true good to be sought for its own sake. And
That's
that's
right.
something
Yeah.
that in our society today we it's hard for us to make that distinction today. We've
It
lost
really
sight
is.
of it, right?
Yeah, it is.
But it
And I
really
think,
is
yeah,
important for understanding this issue.
sure, absolutely. And as I said, I know we've gone long, but I think that's key, right? Because at the end of the day, greed isn't so much about saying, "Oh, you're naughty because you're wealthy," right? In some sort of finger wagging sense. Greed undermines our happiness, right?
Yeah.
Greed destroys our flourishing,
Yeah.
right?
It's a
Uh,
self-destructive behavior.
yeah, and it's hard for us to see it with this one. We can see it more easily, I think, with gluttony, right? We can see it more easily, like say with gluttony, like drinking too much or eating too much, right? If you're drunk all the time, obviously that's going to undermine your happiness. If you're
Right. It
if
it
you're
causes
obese,
deterioration in your physical health.
right? Yeah, if you're obese, that's going to there's problems with that. But it's harder to see it with wealth, right? With the disordered desire for wealth. But I think if you think about that restlessness, that's a good way to think about it. Also thinking about the lack of mercy, right? There, I think another one is, and this doesn't come up explicitly in the list Thomas used, but I think there's a really strong connection between greed and sloth. I
Mhm.
don't know if I'm saying, I'm always confused about the pronunciation of that, Rich. But anyways, um, in Thomas's view, again, he's taking this from a larger tradition, but sloth has to do not with laziness, really, but with an indifference to the spiritual good, right?
Yeah.
So there is a laziness, but it's a laziness towards the spiritual good, right?
Yeah.
And almost
Right.
kind of indifference.
And sort of
It's kind of,
you're indifferent to it. You can't be motivated,
mhm,
and you're defeated by the difficulty
that's right. Yeah.
of pursuing it, right?
Yeah. There's an arduous good there, right? And
Yeah,
you're
and
just
there's
like,
a
yeah,
evil is
prayer
too
is so
great to
hard.
resist. It's too much
Right.
bother.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you can easily see how avarice, attaching you habitually in a disordered fashion to material goods, right, would make it very hard for you to turn your mind and heart towards God, right,
Mhm.
and towards spiritual things, right? I'm working all the time to get the new boat and the second boat and the bigger yacht, and I just don't have time for the spiritual goods, for
Yeah.
corporal spiritual works of mercy, or for contemplation or meditative prayer, or any of those sorts of
Or
things,
keeping holy
right?
Sabbath day.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And not only do I have time, I don't have a taste for it. I
Yeah.
don't delight in it,
Yeah.
right? I think of that man who has sloth. It's like you set a beautiful dish before him, right? But he almost can't taste it, like his sense of taste is coarsened, right?
Yeah. Right.
Even though there's a delicious meal in front of him, he can't enjoy it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He can't even delight in it,
Yeah. And
So I think
that's really the mark. That's the mark of the vicious man, right?
that's
You
true. Yeah,
can't delight in the good.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's boorish, to him, or tasteless. And I think I think that it should be obvious that there's a connection there. I think once you start thinking of, well, I'm putting all my mind and effort and energy and value into the accumulation of material things, yes, of course, spiritual things are going to be less valuable to me.
So one last point, because we are pretty long, I think. But given that there are those people who, due to their circumstance, are in a position where they have to work seemingly incessantly, what, if any, obligations fall to the man with a great surplus to alleviate that condition?
Sure, I think there's there's got to be some, right? St. John Chrysostom famously says, right, that the excess of the wealthy man belongs to the poor, right? I take that to be a little rhetorical, but I think the point of it is important. I think how he would go about doing that would depend on the circumstances, but if he could relieve it to some degree, that would be great. Certainly if he's the employer, right? I mean, this is where I would be
You need to pay him better, right?
Yeah, you need to pay him better, and you need to not demand that he works so much, right? I mean, that's on the side of, it would certainly be on the side of the employer. I think there used to be a way, societies that were founded for giving some relief, right, to those who have to labor that way. But I would I think that you would want to be contributing to that person's good, at least in terms of maybe like some sort of financial support, if it's possible. Did you have something in mind there, Rich?
No, I think this could be a whole other podcast, obviously, and we don't have time to start that one right now. But because people always want solutions, and much of our political debate today rests on this quest for solutions. Right. I mean, we can recognize the problems, and I think it's a bogus, really disingenuous, and it's a disingenuous thing, right, to look at the other side of the political divide and just ascribe to them nefarious motives, saying they don't care about the plight of the poor. But right, I mean, why don't we acknowledge that there is a problem, but that solutions are not necessarily obvious, right? What is the right response? How what are the obligations? That's a whole debate by itself. So I guess what I want to say is it's definitely a problem that there are people who, though they have industry, right? They're not lazy. They are in fact working, and they're working really hard, and they're working all the time, but they can't seem to get by. That's a social problem.
That is a problem. Absolutely.
That's a social problem, right? And it's a problem. It's not just a private problem. Would you agree that this is a problem that has to do with the common good?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I say of course because the common good is us flourishing together, right?
Yeah.
Now that
if our society is such that people, to no fault of their own, can't flourish.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Then that's a social problem, right? So that would seem to mean that there will be obligations that fall to the wealthy in those cases. What What the right answer is, I don't know, but I just think
Sure.
it's important to recognize that.
I think just reflecting here for a moment, I think about the employer who I picked out earlier.
Mm-hmm.
One thing wealthy people can do is create businesses that are better at compensation. Then, like it might actually be the case, right? That a helpful thing, right, is for a number of wealthy people to band together and commit to forming a company that compensates people in a just way for their labor. Do you follow me?
Yeah,
I
the
mean, I would
purpose of which
imagine
is not designed to accumulate wealth for the shareholders, but instead
yeah.
to produce living wages for those who engage in the business.
Sure. And I would think this would be the kind of thing that would make a wealthy person praiseworthy, right?
Yeah.
Insofar as, right, they were actually contributing to the good of others. People don't want just a handout most of the time. I mean, there's some people who are like that, but the vast majority of people don't want to just get a handout, right? They want to.
What they want is for their work not to be futile.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And so, you create companies that, first off, don't require their people to work 60 hours or whatever, and then you create circumstances where they can make enough, right? So that I think, and at that point you're kind of moving over into Catholic social teaching, but there, without necessarily there could be. But without necessarily recourse to government intervention, you can see wealthy people coming together to create, things like this. And you've seen this in the past where wealthy people come together to create orphanages, to create, retirement homes for those who can't, So it's not as if this is sort of pie in the sky, right? Yeah. This is, in fact, the kind of thing that has happened in the past. Does require, though, a certain kind of virtue, right, and not be a greedy person.
Right. All right, well, that was a great discussion. And anyway, let's mention again your Substack. The Logosletter.
It's Logosletter 2022. Over there I'm doing sort of more stuff. I've been kind of getting the focus tighter and tighter, but I'm kind of doing things that are more directly about using kind of ancient forms of wisdom, forms of the love of wisdom to engage with contemporary problems. And so if you like that sort of thing, you check it out.
All right. Okay, thanks, Dr. Smith, for a riveting discussion. And for those out in the audience, I'm glad you were with us. If you stayed with us this long, great. Don't forget to subscribe and so forth and so on. And God bless.